The air inside the San Francisco Superior Courthouse hung heavy, a damp shroud of tension that pressed against the skin, thick with the mingled scents of old wood, stale sweat, and the faint tang of cleaning polish that never quite masked the years of human desperation etched into the walls. Dust motes swirled lazily in the slanted shafts of late March sunlight piercing through the high, narrow windows, their golden glow slicing jagged shadows across the gallery, where spectators crammed the worn benches, their bodies packed so tight that elbows jostled ribs and knees knocked against seatbacks. Their murmurs rolled through the space, a low drone that pulsed like a heartbeat, rising and falling with the rhythm of anticipation, a collective breath held for the drama about to unfold. At the front of the room, elevated on his bench like a stern deity carved from marble, Judge Victor Hensley presided, a graying figure whose temples bore the silver streaks of time and whose jaw was chiseled by decades of delivering justice, or what he deemed justice. His pale blue eyes, sharp and unyielding behind wire-framed glasses, fixed on the young man standing at the defendant's table, a figure whose very presence seemed to challenge the sterile order of the courtroom. Marcus Rise, 24, stood tall and broad-shouldered, his frame straining the seams of a cheap black suit that clung awkwardly to his muscular build, the fabric wrinkled from too many hours in a jail cell and a hasty ironing by someone who didn't care. His dark hair fell in a messy wave over his forehead, a few strands curling defiantly against his tanned skin, and his hands rested casually in his pockets, a posture that radiated defiance, an insolence that irked Hensley to his core. The judge had seen too many like him pass through this room, cocky kids with slick smiles and reckless streaks, their fates sealed before they even opened their mouths, doomed to a cycle of cells and parole hearings. But Marcus wasn't flinching, wasn't shrinking under the weight of the judge's stare, and that alone set him apart. A flicker of something Hensley couldn't quite place, stirring in the back of his mind. Hensley leaned back in his high-backed chair, the leather creaking under his weight like a groan from the building itself, and let his fingers drum a lazy, deliberate rhythm against the polished oak of his bench. Each tap was a punctuation mark, a slow metronome ticking down the seconds until he could close this case and move on to the next, his patience already fraying at the edges. He peered over the rim of his glasses at Marcus, his lips twisting into a sneer that was half smirk, half scorn, a practiced expression that had broken weaker men before they'd even begun to speak. "You stand accused of some serious crimes, Mr. Reyes," he began, his voice booming through the courtroom, dry and cutting like a blade honed by years of wielding authority without apology. "Drug trafficking, conspiracy, possession with intent to distribute. The list is long and ugly. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Witnesses who saw you making drops in back alleys, wiretaps catching your voice on late-night calls, a stash of narcotics pulled right out of your apartment, bagged and tagged with your fingerprints all over it. You think you can talk your way out of this mess?" His tone dripped with the certainty of a man who'd already written the sentence in his head, his fingers pausing mid-tap to flip open the thick case file before him. Its pages creased and annotated with the prosecutor's meticulous notes. He let the words hang in the air, heavy as the humidity that clung to the room, and added, "This isn't some petty street hustle you can charm your way out of, Reyes. You're looking at 20 years minimum, maybe more if I'm feeling generous with the enhancements." His lips curled further, the sneer deepening as he watched for a crack in Marcus's facade. A flinch, a flicker of fear. But Marcus didn't give him one. He stood there, his dark eyes steady and unyielding, meeting the judge's gaze with a quiet intensity that made the gallery shift in their seats, their whispers sharpening into a low buzz that rippled through the crowd like static. The prosecutor, Paul Kendrick, smirked from his seat at the prosecution table, his pinstripe suit crisp and tailored, his comb-over slick with gel that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He shuffled his papers with smug assurance, his fingers tapping a rhythm of their own, a man so confident in his case that he could afford to look bored, his hazel eyes flicking to Marcus with a glint of disdain. The gallery's buzz grew louder, a restless hum that grated on Hensley's nerves, and he tapped his gavel lightly against the block, the sound a sharp crack that cut through the noise like a whip. "Silence," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceiling, and the murmurs died instantly, the spectators settling back into their seats with wide eyes and held breaths. He turned his attention back to Marcus, gesturing with a lazy wave of his hand toward the public defender seated beside the defendant. "Your public defender seems to think you've got something worth saying," he said, his gaze flicking to Clara Nguyen, a frazzled woman in a gray blazer 2 sizes too big, her notepad trembling slightly in her hands as she clutched it like a lifeline. "So let's hear it, Reyes. Impress me. Give me a reason not to send you straight to San Quentin and be done with it." His voice carried a dry amusement now, a challenge laced with the assumption that Marcus was just another kid in over his head, another name on a docket he'd forget by the time he sat down to his evening scotch. Clara shifted nervously in her seat, her pen hovering over her notes as she opened her mouth to speak, her voice barely forming the words, "Your Honor, my client." But Marcus stopped her cold, placing a hand on her arm with a gentle but firm pressure, a silent command that made her freeze mid-sentence. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor, then sat back down, her shoulders slumping as if relieved to cede the spotlight to him, her notepad slipping slightly in her grip. Marcus straightened, his posture shifting from casual to commanding, his broad chest rising as he took a deep breath and let his voice roll out, calm and deep, filling the room like a tide washing over the shore. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he said, the words steady, unshaken, carrying a weight that seemed to settle into every corner of the courtroom. A ripple of shock washed through the space. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, his meaty hand tightening on the edge of his desk. Kendrick's smirk faltered for a split second, his papers pausing mid-shuffle, and Hensley's fingers froze mid-tap, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he squinted at Marcus, amusement flickering in his pale blue eyes like a spark catching dry tinder. "You'll what?" the judge asked, his tone incredulous, almost mocking, as if Marcus had just suggested he could sprout wings and fly out of the courtroom on sheer bravado. Marcus repeated, his voice unwavering, a steel thread running through it, "I'll be defending myself." The gallery erupted into murmurs, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of disbelief and curiosity, some whispering about his nerve, others about his foolishness. Hensley banged his gavel harder this time, the crack echoing like a gunshot through the room, sharp enough to make the front row flinch. "Order," he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his fingers steepled before him. "This should be good," he muttered, loud enough for the spectators in the front row to hear, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips as he adjusted his glasses with a flick of his wrist. Kendrick chuckled, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead, kid. Dig your own grave." But Marcus wasn't digging. He pulled his hands from his pockets, letting them rest on the table, his fingers splaying wide across the scratched surface as he adjusted his stance. The weight of the courtroom settling around him like a cloak he'd worn 1,000 times before. He took a step forward, the cheap suit rustling faintly against his skin, the sound swallowed by the hush that fell over the room as every eye locked onto him. He began his story, his voice weaving a thread that pulled every ear toward him, silencing the whispers, stilling the restless shifting of the crowd. "It started 6 months ago," he said, his tone low, deliberate, a storyteller setting the stage with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks. "In a bar downtown called the Velvet Room. I wasn't looking for trouble. Not then. I was just a mechanic, pulling late shifts at a garage on Mission Street, hands black with grease, back aching from hours bent under cars, trying to keep my head above water, pay my rent, stay out of the mess I'd seen swallow other guys in my neighborhood. But that night, she walked in, and everything I thought I knew about myself went up in smoke." The gallery hushed completely, hanging on his words as if he'd cast a spell over them. Their breaths held, their bodies leaning forward in unison. Hensley raised an eyebrow, his fingers resuming their lazy drumming on the bench, though slower now, more deliberate, and gestured with a slight tilt of his head. "She?" His voice was skeptical, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes, a crack in his armor of indifference that Marcus spotted and latched onto. Marcus nodded, his gaze drifting slightly, as if he could still see her standing there in the dim, smoky light of that bar, her silhouette burned into his memory. Yeah, she. Tall, legs that went on forever, hair like black silk spilling down her back, catching the neon glow from the signs above the bar, reds and blues flickering across her like she was part of the night itself. She wore this red dress, tight, cut low, hugging her curves like it was painted on. The kind of dress that makes you forget your own name, let alone why you're sitting there with a half-empty beer in your hand. She slid onto a stool at the bar, sipping a martini, her lips leaving a faint red stain on the glass, and every guy in the place noticed her. Heads turned, conversations stuttered, beers paused halfway to mouths. But she didn't look at them. She didn't scan the room like some women do, fishing for attention. She looked right at me. He paused, letting the image settle in the room, the tension thickening as the spectators leaned closer, caught in the pull of his words, their eyes wide with the same fascination that had gripped him that night. Kendrick snorted, flipping through his notes with an exaggerated flick of his wrist, his voice cutting through the hush. Sounds like a cheap pickup line to me. Marcus ignored him, his voice dipping lower, a velvet edge creeping in as he leaned slightly forward, his hands pressing harder against the table. Maybe it was, he said, his tone conceding nothing. But it worked. I was at a table with some buddies, guys from the garage, nursing a beer and talking shop. Tire alignments, carburetor tweaks, the usual bullshit, when she got up and walked over. She moved like she owned the place, hips swaying just enough to draw every eye, her heels clicking against the sticky floor. She smelled like jasmine and trouble, a mix that hit me like a punch to the gut, and when she slid onto the stool next to me, her knee brushed mine under the table, deliberate, electric. She smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that said she already knew me better than I knew myself, and said, "You look like someone who could use a little excitement." The courtroom felt the shift. Hensley's smirk faded, his fingers pausing again, Kendrick's pen froze mid-scribble, and the gallery's whispers died completely, replaced by a rapt silence that seemed to thicken the air even further. Marcus went on, his hands gesturing now, painting the scene with broad, deliberate strokes that pulled the room into that bar with him. Her voice was low, husky, like she'd smoked a pack of cigarettes and chased it with whiskey, every word curling around me like smoke. She leaned in close, her breath warm against my ear, her hair brushing my cheek, soft as silk and smelling faintly of something floral, something expensive. She said, "I'm Valentina. Call me Val." Her fingers brushed my arm, light but deliberate, sending a jolt through me I couldn't hide. Not from her, not from myself. I was gone, hook, line, sinker, before I even knew what hit me. Hensley cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses with a quick, irritated flick of his hand, his voice gruff as he interrupted, "This isn't a romance novel, Rise. Get to the point." But Marcus didn't rush. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, enough to make them uncomfortable, the weight of their attention pressing against him like a physical force, then said, "The point is, Your Honor, she wasn't just some girl I met that night. She was a storm, a force that rolled in and tore up everything I'd built, everything I thought I was. That first night, we talked for hours, about cars, the growl of a V8 engine under my hands, the music I'd blast in the garage late at night when the city was quiet, the way the lights looked from the pier when the fog rolled in thick and gray. She had this laugh, sharp and wild, like she was daring the world to catch her. And when she kissed me outside the bar, her hands fisting in my jacket, her lips soft and hungry against mine, it was like gasoline on a match. I didn't stand a chance." The spectators leaned closer still, a few exchanging glances, their breaths shallow, and Kendrick stood, his tone sharp as he jabbed a finger toward Marcus. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? He's spinning a fairy tale here, not a defense." Hensley waved him off with a flick of his hand, his eyes locked on Marcus, the curiosity in them sharpening despite his gruff exterior. "Overruled," he said, his voice firm. "I want to hear where this goes." Kendrick sat back down, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping his pen like a lifeline, and Marcus pressed on, his voice steady but laced with a heat that seemed to warm the room. "That kiss was just the start. She pulled me into her world that night, and I followed. Blind, stupid, willing. She wasn't just a fling, Your Honor. She was the beginning of everything that landed me here, standing in front of you. He took a deep breath, his dark eyes flicking briefly to the gallery, then back to Hensley, and let the weight of his opening settle over the room like a blanket, heavy and inescapable. The judge rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, his voice dry as he leaned back in his chair. So you're blaming a woman for your crimes? That's your play here? Marcus shook his head, his tone firm, unwavering. Not blaming. Explaining. Val wasn't just some woman. She was the key, the one who turned my life into this mess, who dragged me into the fire step by step, and I'm gonna tell you how, Your Honor, every damn detail of it. The courtroom hung on his words, the tension thick enough to choke on, a palpable force that wrapped around every listener, judge, prosecutor, spectators alike. Marcus stepped back, his hands still pressed to the table, his story just beginning. A thread that would unravel everything Judge Hensley thought he knew about the case, about the man before him, about the truth itself. The gallery held its breath, the bailiff shifted his weight, and Kendrick's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a flicker of unease, as Marcus stood there, poised to take them all back to that night at the Velvet Room, to the woman in the red dress who'd set his world ablaze. The Velvet Room pulsed with a life of its own, its dim light flickering like a heartbeat through the haze of cigarette smoke that curled lazily around the bar. A murky veil that softened the edges of the worn wooden counter where Marcus Reyes sat, a half-empty beer cradled in his calloused hand. The bass thumped low and steady from speakers tucked in the corners, vibrating through the sticky floorboards and up into the soles of his work boots. A rhythm that matched the restless energy humming beneath his skin after a long shift at the garage. The air was thick with the mingled scents of spilled liquor, cheap cologne, and the faint musk of bodies pressed too close in the Friday night crowd. Mechanics, dock workers, and barflies who'd stumbled in from the fog-draped streets of San Francisco's Mission District. Marcus leaned back in his stool, his broad shoulders brushing the guy next to him, one of his garage buddies who was mid-rant about a busted transmission, but his mind was already drifting, the monotony of the day weighing heavy on him. Then she walked in, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman in the red dress moved through the crowd like a blade through water, her presence slicing through the chatter and turning heads with every step. She slid onto the stool beside Marcus with a grace that felt deliberate, her knee brushing his under the bar, a fleeting touch that sent a spark racing up his leg, jolting him out of his haze. Her scent hit him hard, a heady mix of jasmine and something darker, something that whispered trouble in a language he didn't need to understand to feel. It wrapped around him, pulling him in, and when she smiled, slow, daring, her lips curving like a secret, she pinned him with eyes that glittered green in the neon glow, sharp and knowing. "You look like you need some excitement," she said, her voice husky, low, rolling over him like velvet dragged across gravel, each word laced with a promise he couldn't yet name. Marcus felt the jolt, his pulse kicking up a notch, thudding against his ribs as her fingers grazed his arm, light but intentional, her nails brushing the sleeve of his faded flannel shirt with a touch that lingered just long enough to make his breath catch. "I'm Valentina," she added, leaning close, her hair, a cascade of black silk, spilling over one shoulder, brushing the edge of the bar as she tilted her head, her lips hovering near his ear. "Call me Val." Her breath was warm, faintly sweet with the bite of gin from her martini, and it sent a shiver down his spine, his skin prickling under the weight of her nearness. Back in the courtroom, the gallery listened, rapt, as he recounted it, his voice low and steady, carrying them into that smoky bar with him. "I was gone right then," he said, his tone heavy with the memory, hook, line, sinker, caught before I even knew what she was casting. Judge Victor Hensley shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him as he adjusted his glasses, his pale blue eyes narrowing with a mix of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "What is this, Reyes? A romance novel?" he asked, his voice dry, cutting through the hush of the courtroom like a whip, his fingers pausing their lazy drumming on the bench. The spectators stirred, a few chuckles rippling through the gallery, but Marcus pressed on, undeterred, his dark eyes locking onto the judge with a quiet intensity that silenced the room again. "We talked," he said, his hands gesturing slightly, painting the scene with broad strokes. "About cars, old Mustangs, the growl of a V8 I'd spent hours tuning at the garage. About music, blues riffs I'd play on a beat-up guitar when the shop was empty. About the city lights, how they shimmered off the bay from the pier when the fog thinned out just right." He paused, letting the memory settle, and added, "Her laugh was wild, sharp, like she was daring the world to keep up with her. It cut through the noise of that bar, made everything else fade out." The gallery hung on his words, their breaths shallow, and Marcus's voice dipped lower. "Then she kissed me outside, under the awning where the fog curled thick around us, her hands fisted in my jacket, pulling me close, her lips hungry, soft at first, then fierce, like she was claiming something. It was gasoline on a match, Your Honor, and I was already burning." The spectators gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the room, their eyes wide, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances as if they could feel the heat of that kiss themselves. Paul Kendrick, the prosecutor, stood abruptly, his pinstriped suit rustling as he jabbed a finger toward Marcus, his voice sharp with irritation. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance. He's spinning a story, not a defense." His comb-over gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his hazel eyes flashing with disdain, but Hensley waved him off with a flick of his hand, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "Overruled," the judge said, his tone firm, a glint of intrigue breaking through his gruff exterior. "Let him go. I want to hear this." Kendrick sat back down, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping his pen like he wanted to snap it, and Marcus continued, his voice steady, carrying a heat that seemed to warm the sterile air of the courtroom. "She took me to her loft that night," he said, his hand splaying wide on the defendant's table as he leaned forward slightly, drawing the room deeper into his tale. "It was up in the Tenderloin, all glass and steel, big windows stretching floor to ceiling, looking out over the city like it was hers to command. The bed was huge, unmade, sheets tangled like a battlefield waiting for a war. She didn't waste time. She pushed me against the wall, her hands tearing at my shirt, buttons popping loose as her nails raked my skin, sharp, deliberate, leaving trails I could still feel the next day." He paused, his eyes distant, reliving it, and added, "She said, 'I like you, Marcus. You're not afraid.'" Her voice was a purr, low and dangerous, and then she was on me, her body pressed tight, all heat and curves, her legs wrapping around me as she pulled me down. The gallery was silent now, the tension thick enough to choke on, every ear straining as Marcus's voice dropped to a near whisper. "We didn't sleep that night. She kept me up, her body moving over mine, her whispers dirty and sweet, things I'd never heard a woman say, things that stuck in my head long after the sun came up, filtering through those big windows in streaks of gold." He straightened, his hands dropping back to his sides, and met Hensley's gaze again, unflinching. "That was the start, Your Honor. That night, she hooked me, and I didn't even try to fight it." The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once, the spectators shifting in their seats, some fanning themselves as if the heat of Marcus's story had seeped into the room. Hensley rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, his voice gruff but tinged with something softer, curiosity, maybe, or grudging respect. "You're saying she pulled you in, Rays?" he asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the bench. Marcus nodded, his tone firm. "Yeah, she was the spark, the one who lit the fuse. And everything that came after, every step that landed me here, started with her, with that night." The gallery buzzed faintly, a low hum of whispered speculation, and Kendrick's pen scratched furiously across his notepad, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. Marcus stood there, his broad frame steady, his story hanging in the air like smoke from that bar, curling around them all, pulling them into the storm that Valentina had unleashed on his life. The velvet room pulsed with a life of its own, its dim light flickering like a heartbeat through the haze of cigarette smoke that curled lazily around the bar, a murky veil that softened the edges of the worn wooden counter where Marcus Reyes sat, a half-empty beer cradled in his calloused hand. The bass thumped low and steady from speakers tucked in the corners, vibrating through the sticky floorboards and up into the soles of his work boots, a rhythm that matched the restless energy humming beneath his skin after a long shift at the garage. The air was thick with the mingled scents of spilled liquor, cheap cologne, and the faint musk of bodies pressed too close in the Friday night crowd. Mechanics, dock workers, and barflies who'd stumbled in from the fog-draped streets of San Francisco's Mission District. Marcus leaned back in his stool, his broad shoulders brushing the guy next to him, one of his garage buddies who was mid-rant about a busted transmission, but his mind was already drifting, the monotony of the day weighing heavy on him. Then she walked in, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman in the red dress moved through the crowd like a blade through water, her presence slicing through the chatter and turning heads with every step. She slid onto the stool beside Marcus with a grace that felt deliberate, her knee brushing his under the bar, a fleeting touch that sent a spark racing up his leg, jolting him out of his haze. Her scent hit him hard, a heady mix of jasmine and something darker, something that whispered trouble in a language he didn't need to understand to feel. It wrapped around him, pulling him in, and when she smiled, slow, daring, her lips curving like a secret, she pinned him with eyes that glittered green in the neon glow, sharp and knowing. "You look like you need some excitement," she said, her voice husky, low, rolling over him like velvet dragged across gravel, each word laced with a promise he couldn't yet name. Marcus felt the jolt, his pulse kicking up a notch, thudding against his ribs as her fingers grazed his arm, light but intentional, her nails brushing the sleeve of his faded flannel shirt with a touch that lingered just long enough to make his breath catch. "I'm Valentina," she added, leaning close, her hair, a cascade of black silk, spilling over one shoulder, brushing the edge of the bar as she tilted her head, her lips hovering near his ear. "Call me Val." Her breath was warm, faintly sweet with the bite of gin from her martini, and it sent a shiver down his spine, his skin prickling under the weight of her nearness. Back in the courtroom, the gallery listened, rapt as he recounted it, his voice low and steady, carrying them into that smoky bar with him. "I was gone right then," he said, his tone heavy with the memory, hook, line, sinker, caught before I even knew what she was casting. Judge Victor Hensley shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him as he adjusted his glasses, his pale blue eyes narrowing with a mix of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "What is this, Rays? A romance novel?" he asked, his voice dry, cutting through the hush of the courtroom like a whip, his fingers pausing their lazy drumming on the bench. The spectators stirred, a few chuckles rippling through the gallery, but Marcus pressed on, undeterred, his dark eyes locking onto the judge with a quiet intensity that silenced the room again. "We talked," he said, his hands gesturing slightly, painting the scene with broad strokes. "About cars, old Mustangs, the growl of a V8 I'd spent hours tuning at the garage. About music, blues riffs I'd play on a beat-up guitar when the shop was empty. About the city lights, how they shimmered off the bay from the pier when the fog thinned out just right." He paused, letting the memory settle, and added, her laugh was wild, sharp, like she was daring the world to keep up with her. It cut through the noise of that bar, made everything else fade out. The gallery hung on his words, their breaths shallow, and Marcus's voice dipped lower. "Then she kissed me outside, under the awning where the fog curled thick around us. Her hands fisted in my jacket, pulling me close, her lips hungry, soft at first, then fierce, like she was claiming something. It was gasoline on a match, Your Honor, and I was already burning." The spectators gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the room, their eyes wide, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances as if they could feel the heat of that kiss themselves. Paul Kendrick, the prosecutor, stood abruptly, his pinstripe suit rustling as he jabbed a finger toward Marcus, his voice sharp with irritation. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? He's spinning a story, not a defense." His comb-over gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his hazel eyes flashing with disdain, but Hensley waved him off with a flick of his hand, his gaze still fixed on Marcus. "Overruled," the judge said, his tone firm, a glint of intrigue breaking through his gruff exterior. "Let him go. I want to hear this." Kendrick sat back down, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping his pen like he wanted to snap it, and Marcus continued, his voice steady, carrying a heat that seemed to warm the sterile air of the courtroom. "She took me to her loft that night," he said, his hands splaying wide on the defendant's table as he leaned forward slightly, drawing the room deeper into his tale. It was up in the Tenderloin, all glass and steel, big windows stretching floor to ceiling, looking out over the city like it was hers to command. The bed was huge, unmade, sheets tangled like a battlefield waiting for a war. She didn't waste time. She pushed me against the wall, her hands tearing at my shirt, buttons popping loose as her nails raked my skin, sharp, deliberate, leaving trails I could still feel the next day. He paused, his eyes distant, reliving it, and added, "She said, I like you, Marcus. You're not afraid." Her voice was a purr, low and dangerous, and then she was on me, her body pressed tight, all heat and curves, her legs wrapping around me as she pulled me down. The gallery was silent now, the tension thick enough to choke on, every ear straining as Marcus's voice dropped to a near whisper. "We didn't sleep that night." She kept me up, her body moving over mine, her whispers dirty and sweet, things I'd never heard a woman say, things that stuck in my head long after the sun came up, filtering through those big windows in streaks of gold. He straightened, his hands dropping back to his sides, and met Hensley's gaze again, unflinching. "That was the start, Your Honor. That night, she hooked me, and I didn't even try to fight it." The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once, the spectators shifting in their seats, some fanning themselves as if the heat of Marcus's story had seeped into the room. Hensley rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, his voice gruff but tinged with something softer, curiosity maybe, or grudging respect. "You're saying she pulled you in, Rays?" he asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the bench. Marcus nodded, his tone firm. "Yeah, she was the spark, the one who lit the fuse. And everything that came after, every step that landed me here, started with her. With that night." The gallery buzzed faintly, a low hum of whispered speculation, and Kendrick's pen scratched furiously across his notepad, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. Marcus stood there, his broad frame steady, his story hanging in the air like smoke from that bar, curling around them all, pulling them into the storm that Valentina had unleashed on his life. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse stood in stark contrast to the memory Marcus Reyes summoned now. Its air thick with the dry scent of old paper and the faint hum of tension from the packed gallery, where spectators shifted on creaky benches, their murmurs a low buzz like distant traffic. The room's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the polished oak of Judge Victor Hensley's bench, where he sat, his graying hair swept back, his pale blue eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses, as he watched Marcus with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders straining the seams of his cheap black suit, his dark hair falling in a messy wave over his forehead, his hands resting lightly on the scratched wood as he recounted the night that marked his descent. A night that began with Valentina's lips and ended with a duffel bag he couldn't unshoulder. "It was a few weeks after we met," Marcus told the court, his voice steady, rolling out like a tide pulling the room back to that humid July evening. She'd been dropping hints, little teases about easy cash, quick jobs, but that night she took it further. The gallery hushed, leaning forward, their eyes wide as Marcus painted the scene with words that carried the weight of memory. "She showed up at my place after my shift, 10 at night, the garage quiet, just me and the radio playing some old blues tune. I was washing grease off my hands when she knocked, standing there in a black leather jacket and that red dress, the one that clung to her like a second skin, her hair loose and wild, catching the porch light." He paused, his hands gesturing slightly, tracing the shape of her in the air. She didn't say much, just smiled, that slow, dangerous smile, and said, "Get in the truck, Marcus, I've got something for you." The courtroom felt the shift, the spectators caught in the pull of his story, and Hensley tilted his head, his fingers pausing their lazy drumming on the bench. "What kind of something?" he asked, his voice gruff, cutting through the silence, his curiosity piqued despite the stern set of his jaw. Marcus nodded, his dark eyes steady. "She drove us to a warehouse off the docks, some crumbling spot near the Embarcadero, all rusted steel and broken windows, the kind of place that smelled like salt and diesel, the bay lapping dark and restless outside. The fog was thick that night, swallowing the streetlights, and she parked us in the shadows, engine off, just the sound of her breathing next to me." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dipping lower. "She turned to me, her lips brushing my neck, soft at first, then harder, teeth grazing my skin as she whispered, "You're gonna shine tonight, baby. This is your shot." Her hands were in my pockets, fingers sliding over my hips, pulling me close, and I could feel her heartbeat through that dress, fast and wild like mine. The gallery stirred, a faint ripple of gasps threading through the crowd, some fanning themselves as if the heat of that moment had seeped into the room, warming the cool air of the courthouse. Marcus continued. She led me inside, dark, damp, the air heavy with mildew and something sharper, like chemicals. A guy was waiting. Rico, she called him. Big, shaved head, tattoos curling up his neck, eyes like he'd seen too much. He barely looked at me, just handed me a duffel bag, heavy, the straps rough against my palm, and said, "Deliver it, 3rd Street, midnight. Don't open it." Paul Kendrick, the prosecutor, smirked from his seat, his pinstriped suit rustling as he shuffled his papers, his comb-over gleaming under the lights. "Convenient," he muttered, loud enough to carry, his hazel eyes glinting with disdain. "A mystery bag and a mystery man. Sounds like a bad movie." A few chuckles broke out from the front row, but Marcus ignored him, his focus locked on Hensley, his voice steady as he pressed on. Valentina smiled, stood there next to Rico, her arms crossed, that red dress glowing in the dim light like a warning I didn't see. She said, "Do it for me, Marcus. Show me you're in." Her voice was a purr, wrapping around me, and when we got back to the truck, she didn't let me think about it. The spectators held their breath, and Marcus's tone grew heavier. She climbed into my lap, her dress riding up, thighs bare and warm against me, her hands tearing at my shirt, buttons popping loose as she kissed me. Deep, hungry, her tongue tasting like gin and danger. She moved against me, hips rocking, her nails raking my chest, and whispered, "You're good at this, baby. Don't stop now." He could still feel her, the press of her body, the way her hair fell in a wild curtain around them, the fogged windows trapping their heat as the truck rocked faintly in the dark. "I did it," he said, his voice raw. "Dropped the bag at 3rd Street, didn't look back. She met me after, kissed me again, said, 'That's my boy.' I was hers, hooked, no questions." Hensley frowned, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "You didn't suspect anything?" Marcus shook his head. "Not then. She made it feel right. Every touch, every word. She'd pull me into hotel rooms after those jobs, champagne on the nightstand, silk sheets under us, her body a weapon she wielded like she'd trained for it. She'd strip me down, her fingers tracing every line of me, promising more if I kept going, saying, 'You're mine, Marcus. Nobody else gets this.'" The gallery buzzed, whispers sharpening, and Kendrick stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? He's got no proof, just a sob story." Hensley waved him off. "Overruled. I want to hear it." Kendrick sat, jaw tight, and Marcus nodded. "Check the footage from the Velvet Room, 6 months back, her in that red dress with me. That's where it started. Then check the burner phones in evidence. Her number's there, encrypted, but it's hers. Trace it." His voice was firm, a challenge, and the room felt the weight of it, the tension thickening as his words hung in the air, a thread pulling them deeper into the storm Valentina had unleashed. The jobs grew frequent as the weeks bled into months, each one pulling Marcus Reyes deeper into a web he hadn't even realized was being spun around him. Valentina's hold tightening with every whispered promise and every stolen touch. What started as occasional errands, picking up a package from a shadowed corner of the Tenderloin, dropping it off at a nondescript warehouse by the docks, morphed into a near-nightly routine, the weight of the duffel bags growing heavier, their contents a mystery he no longer bothered to question. The air in San Francisco seemed to shift with the change, the fog rolling in thicker off the bay, curling around the streetlights like a shroud, muffling the city's hum as Marcus drove his beat-up truck through its veins, the engine's low growl a counterpoint to the adrenaline thrumming in his chest. Valentina was always there, a constant presence now, her scent, jasmine laced with that dark, dangerous edge, lingering in the cab long after she'd slipped out, her laughter echoing in his ears like a song he couldn't shake. "She'd ride me in my truck," Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy as he stood at the defendant's table in the San Francisco Superior Courthouse, his broad hands pressing into the scratched wood, grounding himself against the flood of memories. The courtroom was a stark contrast to those nights, its air thick with the must of old files and the faint tang of sweat from the packed gallery, the light harsh and fluorescent, casting sharp shadows across the benches where spectators sat, their murmurs a restless buzz that rose and fell like waves against a pier. Her dress hiked up, he continued, his tone dipping low, carrying the heat of those moments into the sterile space, bunched around her hips, red fabric catching the dashboard lights as she moved. She'd straddle me in the front seat, her thighs gripping me tight, her hands braced on my shoulders, and say, "You're family now, Marcus. This is us." Her voice in those moments was a velvet blade, cutting through his doubts, slicing away any thought of turning back. And he could still feel the press of her body, the way her curves molded to him, her heat seeping through his jeans as the truck's windows fogged with their breath. The gallery stirred, a faint ripple of gasps and whispers threading through the crowd, their eyes wide as they leaned forward, caught in the pull of Marcus's story. Some shifted uncomfortably, fanning themselves with folded programs, as if the heat of those nights had slipped into the room, warming the cool March air. Judge Victor Hensley rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, his graying brows knitting together as he sat elevated on his bench, the leather of his chair creaking faintly under his shifting weight. His pale blue eyes narrowed behind wire-framed glasses, skepticism warring with a grudging fascination as he watched Marcus, his fingers pausing their usual lazy drumming on the polished oak. "You never said no to her?" he asked, his voice gruff, cutting through the hush like a stone dropped into still water, his tone laced with disbelief and a hint of accusation. "Not once?" Marcus took a breath, his chest rising as he met the judge's gaze, unflinching, his dark eyes steady but shadowed with something raw, regret, maybe, or resignation. "I tried to leave once," he admitted, his voice softening, the words heavy with the weight of that memory. "It was maybe 3 months in. I'd just dropped a bag at some rundown spot off Folsom, cash stuffed in my glove box, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. I was parked by the bay, engine off, staring out at the water, the lights flickering through the fog, and it hit me. Whatever this was, it wasn't just fun anymore. It was heavy, dangerous, and I didn't want it." He paused, his hands clenching slightly on the table, knuckles whitening as he relived it. "I told her I was out, called her from a payphone near the garage, said I couldn't keep doing this, that I was done." The courtroom was silent now, the gallery holding its breath, every ear straining as Marcus's voice dropped lower. "She didn't yell, didn't argue, she just showed up an hour later, climbed into my truck like she owned it. Owned me. She slid into my lap, her knees bracketing my hips, her dress riding up again, black that time, thin straps slipping off her shoulders. Her eyes locked on mine, green and piercing, like she could see right through me, and she said, 'You don't walk away from me, Marcus. You don't get to.' Her fingers tangled in his hair, tugging just hard enough to tilt his head back, and then she kissed him. Slow at first, lips soft and teasing, then fierce, her tongue sweeping in, erasing every ounce of resolve he'd scraped together. "That kiss," he said, his tone raw. It burned away everything I'd planned to say. She moved against me, her body a weapon, her hands sliding down my chest, unbuttoning my shirt, and I was gone again, lost in her. Hensley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his voice sharp but tinged with something softer. Curiosity, perhaps, or a flicker of understanding. "You couldn't say no?" he pressed, his fingers steepled before him, the lines on his face deepening as he studied Marcus, searching for a crack in the story. Marcus shook his head, his admission quiet but firm. "I couldn't, Your Honor. She was everything, every thought, every breath. She'd look at me like I was the only thing that mattered, touch me like she'd die without it, and I'd forget why I ever wanted out. She had me. Mind, body, all of it." His hands dropped to his sides, his shoulders slumping slightly, the weight of that truth settling over him like a shroud. And the gallery stirred again, a low hum of fascination and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Paul Kendrick seized the moment, rising from his seat at the prosecution table, his pinstriped suit rustling as he crossed his arms, his comb-over gleaming under the lights. "Where's this woman now, Reyes?" he pressed, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs with the prosecutor's precision, his hazel eyes glinting with a mix of skepticism and challenge. "You're spinning this tale about some seductress who dragged you into crime. Where is she? Who is she?" His smirk returned, a thin, smug curve of his lips as he shuffled his papers, tapping them against the table with a flourish. Confident he'd caught Marcus in a lie. The gallery buzzed louder, heads turning, whispers sharpening into questions. Where was she indeed? Marcus answered, his voice steady, unflinching. Gone. She vanished after the raid. The night the cops kicked in my door, found the stash she'd left in my apartment. I was alone, half asleep on the couch when they came. She'd been there hours before, curled against me, her hair spilling over my chest, saying, "We're good, baby. Better than ever." Then she was gone, slipped out before dawn, and I didn't see her again. He paused, his jaw tightening, a flicker of anger, or maybe hurt, crossing his face. She set me up, left me holding it all. Drugs, cash, everything. By the time the cuffs were on me, she was a ghost. The courtroom seemed to exhale, the tension thickening as Marcus's words sank in, a palpable force that wrapped around every listener. The spectators leaned closer, some scribbling notes, reporters maybe, others exchanging wide-eyed glances, their faces flushed with the drama unfolding before them. Hensley rubbed his temple again, harder this time, his fingers pressing into the skin as if to ward off a headache, his voice gruff but measured. "So she disappeared, and you took the fall?" Marcus nodded, his tone resolute. "Yeah, she played me, Your Honor, hooked me with every kiss, every night, until I was too deep to climb out. Then she cut the rope." Kendrick jumped up again, his voice rising. "No proof, Your Honor. He's got nothing. Just a story about a phantom woman who conveniently vanishes. Where's the evidence?" His hands gestured wildly, papers fluttering as he waved them, his smirk faltering under the weight of Marcus's calm certainty. Hensley held up a hand, silencing him, his eyes still locked on Marcus. "We'll get to evidence, Counselor. Raise, anything else?" Marcus took a breath, his broad frame steady. "Just this, she was real, and she's out there. I've got the scars to prove it. On my skin, in my head. She made me hers, and I didn't see the trap until it snapped shut." The gallery erupted into murmurs, a chaotic hum that grated on Hensley's nerves, and he banged his gavel, the crack sharp enough to make the front row flinch. "Order!" he snapped, his gaze flicking between Marcus and Kendrick, the lines on his face deepening as he processed the story. A tale of seduction, betrayal, and a woman who'd vanished into the fog. Marcus stood there, his hands back in his pockets now, his story hanging in the air like the echo of Valentina's moans, a siren's call that had led him here, to this courtroom, where everything, his freedom, his truth, hung in the balance. The night the police stormed Marcus Reyes's apartment unfolded like a scene ripped from a nightmare, a chaotic blur that shattered the fragile world he'd let Valentina build around him. It was late September, the San Francisco air thick with fog that pressed against the cracked windows of his third-floor walk-up. A cramped one-bedroom off Haight Street where the walls were stained with years of neglect and the floor creaked under every step. The raid came without warning. 2 a.m., the witching hour, when the city slept and the hum of distant traffic was the only sound bleeding through the walls. Marcus had been sprawled on the sagging couch, half asleep, the TV flickering with some late-night rerun, its blue glow casting shadows across the peeling paint. The stash, Valentina's stash, was tucked in a duffel bag under the coffee table, a silent weight he'd stopped thinking about, its presence normalized by months of her whispered assurances. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse was a different beast now, its air heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint musk of crowded bodies, the gallery packed with spectators whose murmurs buzzed like flies against glass. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his broad frame steady in his cheap black suit, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he recounted that night, his voice low and raw, carrying the weight of betrayal into the sterile space. "The cops kicked in the door," he told the court, his hands gripping the table's edge, knuckles whitening as the memory surged back. Wood splintered, boots pounded the floor, flashlights cut through the dark, shouting, "Police! Hands up!" I was alone, still waking up, shirtless, the couch springs digging into my back. They flipped the place, drawers yanked open, cushions torn, that bag dragged out like it was all they'd come for. The gallery stirred, a ripple of hushed gasps threading through the crowd, their eyes wide as they leaned forward, caught in the visceral pull of Marcus's words. Judge Victor Hensley sat elevated on his bench, his graying brows furrowed, his pale blue eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses as he watched Marcus, his fingers pausing their usual drumming on the polished oak. "She set me up," Marcus said, his tone hardening, a steel edge cutting through the exhaustion in his voice. She'd been there hours before, curled against me on that couch, her hair spilling over my chest, her skin warm under my hands. She'd kissed me slow, said, "We're good, baby," better than ever, her voice soft like a lullaby. Then she slipped out, said she had to meet someone, left me there with that bag and a promise she'd be back. He paused, his jaw tightening, a flicker of anger, or maybe hurt, crossing his face as he met Hensley's gaze. "She didn't come back," he said, his words heavy, sinking into the silence. The cuffs were cold when they snapped on, metal biting my wrists, cops yelling about rights I barely heard. They found the stash, coke, pills, cash, all hers, left in my place like a trap I didn't see closing. She vanished before dawn, gone like smoke in the fog. The spectators shifted, some whispering to their neighbors, others scribbling notes, their faces a mix of shock and fascination as the story unfolded. Hensley leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. "You're saying she planted it?" Marcus nodded, unflinching. "Yeah, Your Honor. She played me, every kiss, every night, building up to that. I was her fall guy, too deep to climb out when she cut the rope." Paul Kendrick, the prosecutor, seized the opening, rising from his seat, his pinstripe suit rustling, his comb-over gleaming under the lights. "Where's your proof, Reyes?" he pressed, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs. "She vanished. Convenient. You expect us to believe this ghost story?" His smirk was thin, smug, his hazel eyes glinting as he waved a hand dismissively. Marcus answered, his tone steady. "Check the burner phones in evidence. Her number's there, encrypted, but it's hers. Trace it. She called me that night, hours before the raid, said she'd be back. She lied." The gallery buzzed louder, and Hensley tapped his gavel, silencing them with a sharp crack, his eyes narrowing as he processed Marcus's claim. A tale of love turned to ashes, a woman who disappeared, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse thrummed with a restless energy as the trial of Marcus Reyes began, its air heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint tang of anticipation that clung to the packed gallery, where spectators jostled for space on the creaky benches, their murmurs a low hum that pulsed like the city's heartbeat beyond the fogged windows. The light streamed through high panes, slanting across the room in golden bars, catching dust motes that danced in the stillness, a stark contrast to the storm brewing at the defendant's table. Marcus stood there, his broad shoulders filling out his cheap black suit, the fabric wrinkled from days in a holding cell, his dark hair falling in a messy wave over his forehead as he faced Judge Victor Hensley. The judge sat elevated on his bench, a graying figure with a jaw carved by decades of rulings, his pale blue eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the polished oak as he watched Marcus with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. The trial had been building for weeks. Arrest, arraignment, endless nights in jail where Marcus replayed every moment with Valentina, piecing together the trap she'd set. But now it was real, the weight of it pressing against his chest as he took a breath and began to weave his tale. "It wasn't just one night," he told the court, his voice steady, rolling out like a tide pulling the room into his past. "She kept me hooked. Late drives through the city, her body pressed against me in the passenger seat, her fingers tracing my arm, her promises whispered between gasps." The gallery hushed, leaning forward, their eyes wide as Marcus's words painted a picture vivid enough to blur the line between courtroom and memory. "She'd lean close," he said, his tone dipping low, carrying a heat that made the air feel warmer, her hair brushing my cheek, her lips grazing my ear, saying, "You're mine, Marcus. Nobody else gets this." Judge Hensley shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him, his fingers pausing mid-tap as he tilted his head, his voice gruff but curious. "This is your defense, Reyes? A woman's whispers?" The spectators stirred, a faint buzz rippling through the crowd, but Marcus pressed on, unflinching, his dark eyes locking onto the judge. "It's how it started," he said, his hands gesturing slightly, tracing the arc of those nights. "She'd pull me into her world, clubs, hotel rooms, back seats. Every time she'd weave it tighter. One night, we were parked by the pier, fog so thick you couldn't see the water, just hear it lapping. She climbed on me, her dress slipping off one shoulder, her thighs gripping me, and said, "This is us, baby. Ride or die." I believed her. The evidence came later that day, grainy footage from the Velvet Room, pulled after Marcus's insistence, flickering on a courtroom screen. There she was, Valentina in that red dress, laughing with him at the bar 6 months back. Her head thrown back, her hand on his arm, the neon lights catching the curve of her smile. The gallery gasped, whispers sharpening into a hum, and Paul Kendrick, the prosecutor, scrambled from his seat, his pinstripe suit rustling, his comb-over gleaming under the lights. "Coincidence," he barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the buzz, his hazel eyes flashing with irritation. "Anyone could have been in that bar. Doesn't prove a thing." His hands waved dismissively, papers fluttering as he tried to regain control, but the screen held the room's attention. A silent witness to Marcus's tale. Hensley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his voice firm. "Go on, Reyes. I'm listening." The judge's glasses glinted as he adjusted them, his curiosity breaking through the gruff exterior, and Marcus nodded, his tone steady. "That footage is just the start. She didn't stop there. Every job, every drop, she was there, pulling strings. She'd kiss me after, deep and slow, her hands all over me, saying, 'You're doing this for us.' I was too caught up to see it. Her touch, her voice, the way she made me feel alive. That's how she got me, Your Honor, step by step." The gallery buzzed louder, and Hensley tapped his gavel, silencing them, his eyes narrowing as Marcus's story sank in. A tale of seduction and betrayal unfolding under the courtroom's harsh light. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse buzzed with a restless hum as the trial of Marcus Reyes pressed into its second week, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint must of bodies packed tight in the gallery, where spectators perched on creaky benches, their murmurs a low drone that ebbed and flowed like the fog outside. The light filtering through the high windows was dimmer today, grayed by an overcast sky, casting soft shadows across the room that seemed to mirror the uncertainty creeping into the case. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his broad frame steady in his wrinkled black suit, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he watched the witness stand, his hands resting lightly on the table, fingers splayed against the scratched wood. Judge Victor Hensley presided from his bench, his graying temples catching the muted light, his pale blue eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses as he leaned forward, his fingers still for once, the usual drumming silenced by the weight of the moment. The witness was a bartender from the Velvet Room, a wiry man in his 30s named Eddie Voss, his faded denim jacket slung over a chair, his stubble-shadowed jaw tight as he shifted under the courtroom's gaze. "She came in every week," Eddie said, his voice rough, carrying the gravel of too many late nights as he stood in the box, one hand gripping the rail. "Always with a new guy, different faces, same vibe. Last time I saw her, maybe 6 months back, she was with him." He pointed at Marcus, his finger steady, and the gallery stirred, a ripple of whispers threading through the crowd as heads turned, eyes locking onto the defendant. "Red dress, black hair, loud laugh. She stood out," Eddie added, his tone matter-of-fact, his brown eyes flicking to Marcus then back to Hensley. They were close, talking, drinking, her hand on his arm like she owned him. Marcus nodded from the table, his voice low but firm. "That's her, Valentina." The gallery buzzed louder, the sound swelling like a wave, and Paul Kendrick shot up from his seat, his pinstripe suit rustling, his comb-over gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Objection, Your Honor," he snapped, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs, his hazel eyes flashing with irritation. "Hearsay. This proves nothing about the charges." His hands waved, papers fluttering as he gestured toward Eddie, his smirk thin and strained, clinging to the edges of his confidence. Hensley waved him off, his tone gruff but steady. "Overruled, counselor. Sit down, I want to hear this." Eddie shrugged, leaning back slightly, his jacket creaking as he crossed his arms. "She was a regular, called herself Val, tipped big, always had cash. That night with him, she was all over it, laughing, leaning in, like she was reeling him in. Saw him leave together, her arm hooked in his." The spectators gasped faintly, some scribbling notes, others exchanging glances, their faces a mix of fascination and doubt as the testimony sank in. Marcus's jaw tightened, his dark eyes steady on Eddie, the memory of that night flooding back. Valentina's laugh cutting through the bar's haze, her touch electric, her voice a velvet hook he couldn't escape. Hensley adjusted his glasses, his voice firm. "Anything else, Mr. Voss?" Eddie nodded. "Yeah, she'd talk about business sometimes, quiet-like, with whoever she brought. Never heard details, but it wasn't small talk." The gallery's buzz sharpened, and Marcus spoke up, his tone resolute. "That's how she worked, Your Honor. Pulled guys in, used 'em. I wasn't the first." Kendrick scoffed. Speculation. But Hensley held up a hand, silencing him, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Marcus. "You've got more, Rise?" Marcus nodded. The phones traced back to her, active till the raid. She set the stage, then left me on it. The room hung on his words, the tension thick, a thread of truth tightening around the case. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse crackled with a raw, electric tension as the trial of Marcus Reyes reached its crescendo. The air thick with the scent of polished wood and the sharp tang of sweat from the gallery, where spectators crammed the benches, their murmurs swelling into a restless roar that echoed off the high ceiling. The light streaming through the tall windows was harsh now, late afternoon sun cutting through the fog outside, casting long shadows that stretched across the room like fingers grasping for the truth. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his broad frame steady in his wrinkled black suit, his dark hair falling over his forehead, his hands clenched into fists on the scratched wood as he prepared to drop the bomb that would shatter everything. Judge Victor Hensley sat on his bench, his graying temples gleaming with a faint sheen of perspiration, his pale blue eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses, his fingers frozen mid-tap on the polished oak, the usual rhythm halted by the weight of the moment. The gallery was a sea of faces, reporters with notepads poised, locals with wide eyes, all leaning forward as Marcus took a breath, his voice steady but heavy, rolling out like thunder across the room. "Her full name," he said, pausing for effect, letting the silence stretch until it was taut, "was Valentina Hensley." The courtroom froze, time itself seeming to stutter as the words landed, a grenade lobbed into the heart of the proceedings. Hensley's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering onto the bench with a sharp crack that jolted the room awake, his face paling as if the blood had drained from it in an instant. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice a hoarse rasp, barely audible over the sudden eruption of chaos. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of benches as spectators surged to their feet, reporters scrambling for the aisles, their pens scratching furiously against paper. Marcus met the judge's gaze, unflinching, his dark eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "Your daughter, Your Honor, Valentina Hensley. She's the one who pulled me in, who set me up." The gallery exploded, a tidal wave of noise crashing through the space, cries of disbelief, shouted questions, the buzz of a dozen voices overlapping in a cacophony that drowned out Paul Kendrick's frantic objection. The prosecutor leapt up, his pinstriped suit rustling, his comb-over askew as he waved his arms, his voice shrill. "Objection! This is outrageous, unsubstantiated." His hazel eyes darted wildly, his smirk gone, replaced by a flush of panic as he clutched his papers like a lifeline. But the words were lost in the uproar, the room spiraling beyond his control. Hensley banged his gavel, the sound a desperate gunshot against the chaos. "Order! Order in this court!" His face was a mask of shock, his hands trembling as he gripped the gavel tighter, his knuckles white, his glasses slipping down his nose as he stared at Marcus, searching for a lie, a trick, anything to deny the truth clawing at him. The gallery settled reluctantly, breaths held, eyes darting between the judge and the defendant, the tension so thick it pressed against the skin like damp fog. Marcus stood firm, his voice cutting through the fading din. "She played me, Your Honor. Every kiss, every night, every job. She used me, then left me to take the fall. That footage from the Velvet Room, the phones, it's all her. You've seen it." The judge's mind reeled, memories flooding back. Valentina, his wild child, his only daughter, missing for months, her cryptic calls about new friends, her sudden silences. He'd thought she was lost to the city's underbelly, not orchestrating it, not sitting across from him in Marcus's story as the phantom woman in the red dress. "My daughter?" he whispered, more to himself than the room, his voice breaking, his stern facade crumbling as the pieces snapped into place, her laugh, her defiance, the way she'd always slipped through his grasp. The gallery buzzed again, softer now, a hum of awe and dread, and Kendrick tried once more. "Your Honor, this is a stunt. No proof ties her to." But Hensley cut him off, his hand slashing the air. "Enough!" His eyes locked on Marcus, a storm of betrayal and recognition swirling within them, the truth too loud to silence. The San Francisco Superior Courthouse trembled with the aftershocks of Marcus Reyes's revelation, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and the acrid tang of adrenaline that lingered from the gallery's eruption. Where spectators now sat stunned, their murmurs a low, jagged hum that pulsed against the walls. The light from the high windows had softened, late afternoon sun bleeding into dusk, casting long, wavering shadows across the room that seemed to mirror the uncertainty settling over the proceedings. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his broad frame rigid in his wrinkled black suit, his dark hair damp with sweat at the temples, his hands clenched into fists as he watched Judge Victor Hensley, the man whose daughter had unraveled his life. The gallery was a sea of held breaths. Reporters poised with pens, locals clutching seat edges, all waiting for the judge's next move after the bombshell that Valentina Hensley, his own flesh and blood, had orchestrated the chaos. Hensley sat frozen on his bench, his graying temples slick with perspiration, his pale blue eyes glassy behind wire-framed glasses, the stern lines of his face softened by a shock that bordered on collapse. His gavel rested where it had fallen, its clatter still echoing in his mind, his hands trembling as they hovered over the polished oak, fingers twitching as if unsure whether to grasp for order or surrender to the weight of betrayal. "Case dismissed," he rasped, his voice a cracked whisper, barely audible over the stunned silence, then louder, strained, "Mistrial pending investigation." The words landed like stones into a still pond, ripples of disbelief spreading through the room, and the gallery roared back to life. Shouts, gasps, the scrape of benches as reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of questions and speculation. Marcus stood firm, his dark eyes locked on Hensley, his voice cutting through the din. "She played me, and you know it now." His tone was steady, resolute, a thread of vindication woven through the exhaustion, his broad chest rising as he took a breath, the weight of months, arrest, jail, trial, lifting just enough to let him stand taller. Paul Kendrick leapt up, his pinstriped suit disheveled, his comb-over askew, his hazel eyes wild with protest. "Your Honor, he's lying. This is manipulation," he barked, his voice shrill, hands flailing as papers spilled from his grasp, scattering across the prosecution table like fallen leaves. The evidence still points to him. Dismissal's absurd, but his words drowned in the uproar, the gallery's noise swallowing his plea, his smirk replaced by a flush of desperation as the case slipped through his fingers. Hensley didn't respond, didn't even look at Kendrick. He rose abruptly, his chair creaking as he turned, his robe swishing with a hollow sound, and fled to his chambers, the door slamming behind him with a thud that silenced the room for a heartbeat. Inside, alone, he slumped against the wall, his breath ragged, his hands clawing at his tie as if it choked him. The weight of Valentina's betrayal crushed him. His daughter, his wild, untamed girl, missing for months, her cryptic calls about new friends, now a haunting refrain. He'd pictured her lost, not scheming, not seducing a man like Marcus into a drug ring, not leaving him to face the gallows of his own court. Her laugh, sharp, wild, echoed in his skull, her green eyes staring back from a face he'd failed to control, and now the truth sat heavy. She'd played them both, father and pawn, with a ruthlessness he couldn't fathom. The courtroom buzzed on, the bailiff shouting for order, the gallery spilling into the aisles, but Marcus didn't move, his gaze fixed on the empty bench, the reality sinking in. Dismissed, but not free, not yet. The mistrial meant more waiting, more scrutiny, Valentina's shadow still looming, her whereabouts a question no one could answer. Kendrick stormed out, muttering curses, his papers clutched in a crumpled fist, while reporters swarmed the steps outside, their voices a dull roar through the walls. Hensley, in his chambers, pressed his forehead to the cool wood of his desk, the case file before him a blur, his decision a fracture. Justice deferred, his daughter's ghost, the fracture's cause, leaving Marcus in limbo and the courtroom echoing with a truth too jagged to heal.